I'm Julie Herman of Jaybird Quilts and Lazy Girl Designs, and welcome back to the Lazy Angle Basic Sew Along. We are currently working on the Rhapsody Quilt. This is video 6 of the 6 video series. If you haven't watched the previous ones, I suggest you watch those before jumping in here. In our previous videos, we went over fabric selection, cutting, made our Lazy Angle blocks, some of our small companion blocks, turned them into larger blocks, and here we are ready to put our quilt top together. At this point, you should have 9 blocks. We are on the bottom of page 10 in your pattern. When you go to sew your blocks together, you could just push them together, sew the seam. But as we've done with the other things, we want to make sure that we are protecting our points. We have our lazy angle points that are in the 4 corners of our blocks with the lazy angle blocks. And we have flying geese points that are in the middle of all of our blocks. The first thing we want to do is a hang pin here to make sure that we get this point exactly to this point. And if you have never seen me demonstrate hang pin before, I'm going to head on over to the machine in just a moment to show you that. The other thing we want to worry about is our lazy angle points. So after we do our hang pin, we want to sew with our lazy angle block on top. So let me show you what that'll look like. So you'll arrange your 2 blocks with your lazy angle block on top. That way when you're sewing this seam, you'll be able to keep an eye right there on where your point is and make sure that you don't sew in too much and lose that point when sewing this seam. So let's head on over to the machine and I will show you how to do a hang pin. I'm going to show you the hang pin technique. This is my favorite technique for making sure that you match points up from one block to another. We begin with a simple straight pin. And you want to insert it right where the point is. So if I flip it over to this side, you can see right where that point is. And ideally that's a 1/4 inch seam allowance, but that's not always the case. So we're going to focus on where did our points land, not where should they have landed. So now that we have this pin hanging, we are going to insert it into the same location on this piece. And you want to make sure everything is right sides together. So we're going to go in right here. And then we're going to hug these together. And our pin is going to be hanging there, hence why it's called hang pin. Now what you want to make sure before you do anything else is that this is a perfect plus sign. If you shift things to the left or to the right, your pin will move with it and things will not be aligned properly. So you want to keep things so that they are perfectly matched on top of each other. That is what this pin is doing for us. So once you have that perfect plus sign, you're going to take 2 additional pins and place 1 on either side. And that way we're nice and secure when we go ahead to take this out. Now is this technique perfect? No, nothing's perfect, but I find that it has pretty good results for lining things up, better than other techniques that I've tried. Instead of sewing the length of this piece, in case it's not right, and then having to take it all out, we're just going to sew right here, about 1/2 inch before and after. So I'm just going to line things up. You never want to sew over your pin, so make sure you start after where your pin is. Move your pin if needed. A stiletto can be extra helpful here to keep everything exactly where you want it to be. And so nice and slow, and you want your needle to land right where that point was that we had our hang pin. See how that looks? There we go. That is pretty darn close. That is really good to me. That is, if you can only tell that I have a little bit extra of my cream. If you really zoom in there from a distance, that looks like perfect points. So I'm happy with that. Now that I have that taken care of, I'm going to fold my blocks back together, right sides together, and sew the length of the seam. And I'm going to do it with my lazy angle block on top so that I will be able to keep track of these points. If you'd like, you can go ahead and pin at these intersections. There's no need to backstitch at the beginning and end because we will be adding borders. So what I want to do is just slowly begin on my piece right where my point is. And let me show you what that'll look like. So here's what that looks like. I've gone ahead and protected that point. So I would continue sewing down the length of this seam, piecing my rows together, and then putting my rows together to complete the center of my quilt top, keeping an eye on my lazy angle points to make sure that I don't lose those in the seam allowance. Let's talk about borders. The information for borders for the Rhapsody quilt are on page 11 of your pattern. I've gone ahead and made a miniature of one block so that I can show you what I want you to understand about borders. Really small, really easy to see, and I hope this helps you out. Imagine this is your finished quilt. Obviously, your finished quilt is a little bit bigger than this, but imagine this is your finished quilt. Most pattern authors, like myself, give you the border measurements, and I've done that on page 11. But the reality is, none of us are perfect. And just because at this point this should measure something doesn't mean that it does. First thing I want you to do is measure the finished width and height of your entire quilt. And I know that can be hard with something as large as this quilt, and that's why I'm showing you on a mini, but I think it's well worth the time. So you can see here, this should have been 6.5, but it really is 6.25. So why is that? It just happens. A little bit more ended up in the seam allowance. My piecing wasn't perfect. A variety of things can happen, especially in terms of a large quilt. I went ahead and measured one of my blocks, and it should have been 21.5, but it was closer to 21 inches. So as you can imagine, that can compound over the size of an entire quilt, and you could lose 1/2 inch all the way up to 1 inch, and that's okay. As long as you haven't lost your points and everything looks good, it doesn't really matter if you've lost a little bit in the overall size of the quilt. But what does matter is your border size. So as you can see here, I've cut these at 6.5. So they're now 1/4 inch too long. If I wasn't paying attention and hadn't measured, and I just went ahead and did what people often do with borders, which is fold it in half, find the middle of the quilt, pin, find this end, pin, find this end, pin, and then go ahead and ease it all in. When I go to press it open, it's gonna end up wavy. If you've ever seen a border that ends up kind of like that and your long arm quilter is not super happy and it ends up wavy, that's why that can happen, because your borders were too long. So it's really important to take proper measurements of your quilt. I give you the measurements on page 11, but that's if everything is perfect, and rarely is it. So go ahead and get your measurements and then add your first 2 border pieces. And normally when you have something as small as this, you sew with the small item on top. But as you may have guessed with everything else we've done, we want to sew on this side. And we want to do that so we don't lose our points. So once your border is the proper length, still fold it in half and do what I was showing and pin it in place, and then sew from this side so that you can make sure you don't lose any of your points here, here, and down the length of your entire quilt. Once you have both of your side borders on, press to the border since there's bulk here and no bulk here. Go ahead again and measure, and then cut your top and bottom and add those on in the same method. And then repeat for the larger border. Thank you for joining us here today. I hope you have enjoyed making the Rhapsody quilt and the entire Lazy Angle Basics series. If you have, please be sure to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future sew-along videos. I have a bonus video that will be available tomorrow to show you how to put your binding on by machine. I was short on time when doing my original Rhapsody quilt, and I want to show you best practices if you'd like to apply your binding by machine. I'll be back this spring with the Cuppa Tea Sampler Quilt Sew-Along. I look forward to applying all our skills we learned in the Lazy Angle Basics to make a beautiful sampler quilt.